another thing to say, I feel comfortable in voting. I also tell people sometimes that I want it to be like voting should be a part of our nature. It should be something we do naturally. And if you see black faces there, it's like going to church. What do? You should go to the, I know many of you have gone to vote. You talk to people. You shake hands. You engage in a social intercourse. But if you've been used to going to places that were all white, that could not happen. Especially if some of those white people didn't, through their frowns or other, showed that they did not want you there. But if you saw someone from your church at the polling place, or from your job at the polling place, and above all, someone who looked like you, then it could become an everyday endeavor. In fact, I used to say, I want voting to become so much a part of our nature that we take it for granted. We don't take it for granted in not voting. We take it for granted in the sense that we do it all the time. It's sort of like going to church for some people. You know, you do it every Sunday. People should go vote just because they're used to doing it. And that, to me, is really when voting places become effective and a part of the community. A voting place should be just as much a part of your community as a school, as your church, anywhere else, and you should feel just as comfortable going there. You know, there are a lot of people who still don't feel comfortable going to voting places. Now, I've talked about what I call the pebbles. That is the grid. You know, you go in and you can cast your ballot. But casting your ballot and voting is still not enough. In our society, there have been other challenges to effective use of the vote. And one of the other cases that I handled back in the 1990s and early 2000s was a case that was called the Dillard litigation. Much has been written about it. You all probably don't know as much about it, but at one point, that case involved over 300 jurisdictions in the state of Alabama. City boards, county boards, school boards, they were all under my jurisdiction. And what I did was, I outlawed at-large elections and made sure that there were single-member districts so that blacks could get elected. And as a result of that one case, over several hundred blacks were elected in the state of Alabama at the local level. I think Dillard is probably one of my proudest cases, only in the sense of being most effective. But it stands for the principle that even if you can cast your ballot, if it has no meaning, if you can't elect anybody, what difference does it make? If everything is at large, you'll never get to elect anyone you want. So you set up single-member districts so that blacks can have a district where they can elect someone. And that's really important because it's a threshold to me to effective democracy, just like it was in seeing someone at the polling place who looks like you. It's an effective part of a democracy that you see an elected official that also looks like you. That to me is participatory democracy. Now, President Ross knows about my other case where I dissented involving gerrymandering, which is a very vicious thing. And what it does is it locks people in. It's sort of the opposite of at-large elections. It locks people in so that your vote is diluted and it doesn't mean as much. It's kind of a complicated system, but let me assure you of one thing, it works. And it can dilute your right to vote, and it can keep you from having an effective voice. The other requirement is just having unnecessary voting requirements to keep people away from the polls. set up a huge number of requirements to make it as hard as possible for people to vote. And of course, there's the problem about how much money controls everything in our election cycle. The person who has the most money can buy the most spots and therefore get his or her name out there. And if you are poor and you have no money in our current system of democracy, if you can't get your name out there, how can you ever hope to get elected? Everyone should have an opportunity to run for office, whether you are poor or rich. The fact that you are rich should not entitle you to have more of an opportunity to get elected. In other words, the field has to be level. Otherwise, it's not an equal opportunity to participate in the democratic process.
Yes, sir.
And so we start with the pebbles, but you know, just casting a vote is not enough. There are challenges out there. And these challenges are, whether it's gerrymandering, whether it's money, whether it's any other scheme that comes up to keep your ballot from counting. You have to be, in addition to casting your vote, vigilant in knocking down these barriers to effective voting. And finally, I actually think there are three things. First of all, as I said, hit the pebbles. Simple act of voting. It's not enough. Great. You can't do without it, but it's just not enough. The next one is knocking down barriers. We're doing that, but you must do it. You're probably going to do it for the rest of your life. As long as there are people out there who want to control your country, people will set up barriers. You've always got to be diligent in knocking those down. But the third part of really casting a ballot is civic engagement. And this gets back to my walk down my driveway to those students. It's not enough to cast a ballot. It's not enough to get rid of these barriers. True participatory democracy means campaigning for others, like those young boys from ASU. That was the ultimate part, or one of the ultimate parts, of true democracy. They were out there trying to get me to vote for their candidate. It took 70 years, took my 70 years to get there, you know? See those young men out there, you know, starting out with just let me have that ballot. Here's someone who not only knows I have the ballot, but who wants me to vote for their candidate. The second part of civic engagement is running for office. Until we have the courage and the fortitude and the belief in ourselves to actually run for office, our ballots will never really count. And it's not enough to say, you know, I or you should do it. You should ask yourself whether I should run for office. And until people are willing to stand up and run for office, we will never truly have an effective democracy. And finally, then I'll sit down. And this is a hard lesson for me, and it really talks about what I call the stroll down my driveway. Is doing something, I actually should say, it's not doing what I'm doing today. When I saw those young boys, I was going down there to preach to them about what they should and should not do. I now realize those young men, and this is the final lesson, is listen to them. Listen to young people. Don't always preach to them. They have a voice.
Amen.
And listen to them. And I went down there and I changed my mind and I said, tell me why I should vote for your candidate. I'm 70, they're 18, but that doesn't mean they can't tell me something. And as older people, I guess if I want to leave one thing with you, listen to these young people when they come to your house. Don't always preach to them. And that was a wonderful lesson for me. So I'm going to sit down now. I've done a lot of preaching. And as I get older, I want to do some more listening. I don't know how many young people we have in here, but I want you to tell me what I should do now. It's your time to come forward. I am ready to listen. Thank you very much. I was not putting in anything on the candidates here.
We did want to have a few minutes we allotted for some questions and answers. So I'm sure the judge would listen to some questions.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe you can pontificate and respond. Are there any questions? We have a microphone in the center of the room if there are questions for the judge. Don't all rush down at one time.
I'll ask a question.
Sure. Isaiah Sankey.
Good afternoon, everyone. Your Honor, it's a pleasure to be here. I certainly know that I missed something by being late. After you've had the courage to run for office and once you put things in place to elect folks that look like you, do you have anything to say about how do you share in the economic prosperity and enjoy, and how do you share in the prosperity and the economic gain once you've elected folk that look like you? Let me see if I can rephrase that. Once you've elected folk that look like you, then how can you be assured that those folks that you are elected to represent are going to participate equally in the economic gain and prosperity?
Oh, you mean if they don't live up to their promises?
Well, maybe.
Vote them out. No, but you're right. There is a question of accountability, and that's what's so beautiful about our democratic process. And don't get me wrong about one thing when I say look like you. I think that in the 80s and 90s that was important. But I actually look forward to the day when whether someone looks like you doesn't matter. The question is, do they think like you? What are their policies? What are their goals? And I do think we needed that period of time in order for people to feel comfortable in participating in the process. But in all true honesty, I think it's an interim process. And I think we eventually come to the point where, you know, someone can be of a totally different hue and yet represent your values. Someone can be exactly of your hue and not represent your values. And so we need to reach that point as well. And I look forward to that. That to me is that perfect participatory democracy. That's when you have people of all races, both genders, I'm going to say all genders, both genders participating, and the real issue then is issues. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Councilman. Thank you. Commissioner, thank you. Yes.
Judge Thompson, so you talked about some of the barriers that get erected to our, impede our right to vote.
Right.
And so at a time when those barriers were laws that said you couldn't vote, or then those barriers began to be things like policemen showing up or other kinds of things that might have been more obvious than some of the barriers that we face today.
Right.
How can we remain vigilant about fighting barriers that we might not even be able to see, that seem to be a bigger threat to us now?
You know, that's a wonderful question. back in the 60s it was harder, but the barriers were so evident. Today, they're so much more subtle, and yet still quite effective. You know, I've been on the bench now for 37 years, and 38 years. And I've seen in not only whether it's in employment law, or whether it's in First Amendment law, or whether it's in voting, discrimination, restraints on your ability to say what you want, are no longer sort of, you know, written in placards. In other words, if someone wants to fire you for an impermissible reason, they don't say, well, you're gone because you're black anymore, or you're white, or you're Hispanic, or you're gay. Instead, they come up with other reasons. But the bad reasons are still there. And you just have to fight harder. And you have to go at the subtlety. And sometimes that's the frustration of the law is, you know, our Chief Justice of the United States said after Obama, we lived in a post-racial world. I hate to take issue with well, I think you get the gist. You all laughed. I'm not going to follow up with anything else. But subtlety doesn't mean that it's not wrong. And it requires you to be vigilant. But you have to be also smart. And that's the challenge. Many of the cases that I've recently handled, you know, did not involve someone using the N-word or stuff like that. Isn't that right, Mr. Ross? So you have to look between the lines. And you still have to call it like you see it. Even though the words may not be explicit, the outcomes can sometimes be the same. So for you, all I can say is just have to work harder. And be more sensitive and be smarter.
You know, any other questions? Yes.
So I have watched you for many years and have admired your brilliance and what you've done in the legal realm, on the bench, and for our community as a whole. We all in this room understand the power of the vote, but the young folks, younger than me, don't vote.
Yes.
And they are at 7%, 3%, and sometimes in our own community, 0.89% turnout. Where do we go, or where did we go wrong in this effort to, you know, knock down the barriers that those who are coming behind us didn't even care to vote?
I posed that question to some young people recently, and I didn't get the answer that I thought I would get. Obviously, young people don't know the history that we know. Actually, I consider you one of those young people. I think you apparently do know it. And you know, you say to them, well, we died for the right to vote. And which is true. But unfortunately, I don't think that's going to get them to the polls because they were not there. And I think I've learned the lesson that the way to find out why young people don't vote is to ask young people why they don't vote. And I think they will tell you things like, I don't see anyone out there who's worth voting for. Or, I don't see why my vote, you know, I've been voting, but it doesn't seem to count. And how do you answer that? And I've been struggling with trying to come up with an easy answer, or even an answer at all, let alone, even a difficult answer would be nice. But I think what you have to do is approach it from a broader perspective and say, okay, you didn't vote because you didn't see someone out there who was worth voting for. Run for office yourself. I think it's going to require a lot more sophistication on our part than just simply saying, oh, you know, we died for the right to vote, because I don't think young people relate to that directly. And there's also something else to remember. Many of us were young and we didn't vote. It's not as if this is the first generation that's been like that. So maybe we should look into ourselves and say, why weren't we more engaged at that age? But I think the main thing is the dialogue itself. And I think it's things like ASUs. I don't know whether ASU was sending those kids around, or just, when I say sending them around, I mean maybe it was something that was going on in the university itself. But college like this, you should have thousands of kids who are out there going around trying to get people to vote for someone in particular. I don't really care who they vote for or who they're campaigning for. To me, it's just refreshing to see those faces out there. They can be campaigning for someone I absolutely detest. But it would just, I would love to just see them out there doing it. If I could see them out there doing it, even though they're campaigning for the wrong person. The fact that the wrong person gets elected is temporary. The fact that they're out there campaigning, to me, is something that may be a lifetime. And that's the value of it. Thank you.
We have another question, Mr. Barnum.
Good afternoon. Good morning, Judge. I have a question that has to do with, I'd like to get your opinion on what remedy could be used, could be devised to solve the problem of white flight. The more blacks become elected to city and county positions, there tends to be more dissolution of white power in a city. For instance, in Chicago, Detroit, Birmingham, Washington, D.C., as blacks become more powerful, there tends to be these suburban communities popping up. In Birmingham, Jefferson County, as blacks became empowered, whites began to move out of Jefferson County, move into Leeds, into Shelby County and other places. They take the money out of the city, the financial structure that's in the cities goes out, and then the problems are blamed on those black city officials. I see, in my vision, I see the same thing occurring gradually in the city of Montgomery. As we move to a position of majority in the city of Montgomery, in the next 5 years, Montgomery will be 52 to 48% black to white ratio. Suddenly, Pike Road pops up, and the power moves to Pike Road. The money moves to Pike Road. The taxes at Home Depot and other places move to Pike Road. Now Pike Road is taking the money out of the Montgomery public school system and building up another system. Is there any way to stem that flow of taking the finances and the wealth and the power out of the cities once blacks come into power?
Unfortunately, that is a political question. It's not a legal one. Actually, I should say fortunately, that's a political question and not a legal one. But I want to touch on something that I think if I had, after having talked so much about the power to vote, there is one area of the law that I've witnessed over the last 37 years that is terribly distressing. And I think in some measure we courts have failed. And that is in school desegregation. Our schools are more segregated today in many ways than they were when I went to my own Jim Crow high school in Tuskegee. And in some ways they're even worse because the tax base is even lower today than it was back then. And that's not just true in Montgomery, it's true across this nation. In fact, I think there's some studies to show that more kids every year keep going more and more to segregated schools. And what that means, obviously, is that If these schools, if the white kids withdraw from the schools, the tax base goes away. No one wants to support the schools become poor, and they get poorer, and they get poorer. And I think in some measure we courts failed in that regard when we allegedly desegregated schools. I personally think that the solution would have been, if I had my druthers, and if I could have convinced a few other judges, is there's a section of the law I did not mention to you called 1981. And that law says that a black person has the same right to enter into a contract as a white person. It's that law that basically applied to things like, even though there was no what we call state wasn't involved, in private conduct, blacks had an opportunity to participate on an equal basis. If I could have done it again, if I could have convinced some others, unfortunately I guess I was probably too young, I would have gone after those private academies. I would have undone those private academies and made those kids go to the public schools so that the tax base was there. That's what I would have done. But that was not the law.
We want to take one more question, Mr. Caven?
Judge, thank you for your time. With the increased attention on gun rights and the debate, my question to you is, what's the difference with police officers at the polling station and citizens parading around with assault weapons? Will the court intervene and make an effort to make that voting precinct, those voting precincts as neutral as possible?
One of the things about being a judge, a federal judge, is that I can't comment on a case that may come before me because I can't prejudge it. And I've often said that I'd rather keep my mouth shut. And when the case comes before me and someone pays the filing fee for the clerk of the court, I'll then tell you what I think. Actually, there's a story about that too. You know, I ordered Justice Moore to take the 10 Commandments out of the Alabama Supreme Court. And not everybody supported that decision, but I thought it violated the religion clause, and the decision was affirmed. But I think I was the only man in the state of Alabama who had not seen the 10 Commandments, because I said that if that case comes before me, they're not going to have any reason on the face of the earth to move for me to get off of it like I had prejudged it, because I hadn't even seen the thing. And so that's the life I've always lived. And that's one of the restrictions of being a judge, is that sometimes you have to stay away from controversy and just let the controversy come to you. And all too often it does come to you. So I'll give you my answer if someone files a lawsuit.
Please, everybody, let's give another round of applause for our... You know, in reference to one of the comments that the judge made, one of our attendees is the local elections, director of elections, Darryl Parker. And so Darryl Parker called me yesterday and interested in having students come over and participate as poll workers. And so that's an activity that I think is not only open to students, but to all people. And so I think it speaks directly to your comments in terms of making the polling place a more accessible and inviting environment. And so we have the opportunity to do that. And I think Darryl Parker is one of the people making that reality.